Mort pour rien. Vous avez combattu dans une guerre juste où des assassins fanatiques et sans honneur cherchent à asservir par la terreur des hommes, des femmes, des enfants désarmés que vous aviez mission de protéger contre cette violence aveugle.
Caporal Johnson Girardus. Caporal-chef Tapa Kissan. Délia DGF Kovac Clément. Sergent Ousseni Fakrou.
These men being honored died in Afghanistan. The names of these men, most of them extremely young, will join the list of over 3,000 soldiers of all nationalities who've lost their lives in a war that has now been going on for over 10 years. The message from the politicians, both yesterday's and today's, that has constantly been drummed into the grieving families, and indeed to everyone, is that these soldiers did not die in vain. In Afghanistan, these soldiers belong to the largest military coalition since the Second World War, 150,000 troops from over 40 countries. In 2011, the governments of the Western nations announced the end of the military intervention. The war machine is now gradually packing up. The international coalition is leaving without claiming victory. The feeling is more of a job unfinished or unfinishable. The coalition is leaving behind a country that has given up counting its dead. 10,000, 20,000, who knows? A country still at war, in shreds, staring into an abyss. It's time certain questions were asked. For whom or for what was it so important to go to war in Afghanistan? Questions which no one wanted to ask when operations began. It all seemed so obvious. An act of self-defense in the wake of September 11th, 2001. This is where it all began, with this gaping, smoking wound. A humiliating inferno which would soon swallow the entire world.
There been so much national
anger, shock. We couldn't believe they did this to us. It's the first time in U.S. history. Why fly a plane into a building? And then what you begin to think is, these people really hate us. And then what a lot of Americans were thinking, and even in the government, is that you're dealing with an irrational, fanatic enemy.
Grande Amérique a été touchée sur son territoire. Le terrorisme, c'était pour le monde arabe, c'était pour peut-être un peu l'Europe, mais pas pour les États-Unis. Leur réaction était une réaction de revanche. Nous, la Grande Amérique, nous avons attaqué par ces gens-là qui viennent de ce pays inexistant. On va leur montrer qui nous sommes.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
These people, this country, was Afghanistan, being governed at the time by the Taliban. At their head was the invisible Mullah Omar, of whom there existed only one photograph. The mysterious Taliban were the perfect target. They'd allowed bin Laden to set up al-Qaeda training camps in the Afghan mountains. So it was on their country that American vengeance would fall.
It was some kind of bad dream for me, because I was able to know the consequences of that.
Weighing up the consequences of the American announcements was the spokesman of the Taliban. After 9/11, he became the face and the voice of the Afghan government.
I was thinking the influence will come to Afghanistan because the most famous enemy of America is in Afghanistan. And they will be not patient to try for revenge.
Revenge was not slow in coming. The countdown had begun. As early as 20th September 2001, George W. Bush addressed the American Congress and passed sentence. The target was not just a man, nor a terrorist network, but an entire country.
Tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands on the Taliban. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land. Give the United States full access to terrorist training camps so we can make sure they are no longer operating. These demands are not open to negotiation or discussion.
Yet, negotiation is precisely what the Taliban government was offering. Starting the day after the attack, Mullah Zaif, spokesman of the Taliban government, established a daily press conference for the international media in Pakistan, where he was ambassador.
We condemn the terrorism and terrorism activities. We call all the people, all the countries to come negotiation, and we are part of this world. We are happy to help with the people. We are happy to help with any action which is for the peaceful.
But footage of these press conferences, taken by journalists from the world's major media networks, rarely reached the Western TV screens.
I sent so many letters to American, to the Congress, to the Parliament, even to the Bush administration. I told them the people of Afghanistan don't want to fight. Find alternative way. We are ready to negotiate.
Images of Ground Zero overpowered everything else. They were shown constantly on the TV screens of a world still in shock. The American government didn't listen to anyone, not even its own secret services.
In the intelligence community, there was a lot of discussion at that initial moment. Should we target the Taliban? All right? And there were people at that time that said we should not, because the information we had was that yes, the Taliban played host to al-Qaeda, but they really didn't know about 9/11. They did not participate in 9/11. Not a single Afghan, not a single Taliban was in that terrorist act.
The American government didn't bother to check the details. As far as they were concerned, al-Qaeda's terrorism and the Taliban's fundamentalist regime were one and the same. It was reductionism that the United States had no trouble defending. For the soldiers who wanted to strike swiftly and hard, a country and a government offered a much easier target than a nebulous terrorist network.
The Taliban, they were hosting al-Qaeda, so then they became a target. Now, if you're going to host terrorists, well, too bad. Poor lifestyle choices. You shouldn't have been hosting al-Qaeda. They attacked us, they killed 3,000 Americans, so we're going to target you too.
The driving force for the war had been established. The United States now made the warning explicit. Their cause had to be shared by all.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
This warning amounted to a threat aimed at other countries in the region, especially Pakistan, Afghanistan's powerful neighbor.
It was General Colin Powell who rang me up, and he did tell me that you are either with us or against us. But then my own Director General of Inter-Service Intelligence, DGISI, was visiting United States, and he rang me up and told me that Mr. aNaRCHo told him that if Pakistan doesn't join us, you will be bombed to Stone Age.
Pakistan, a country of some 180 million Muslims. From George W. Bush's first threats, angry protesters filled the streets of Islamabad in support of Afghanistan and the Taliban. The president was caught between his people on one side and pressure from the Americans on the other.
Therefore, we cannot be in line with Taliban. The other was then the implications of opposing United States and India together, because India was prepared to give them all the support. So if Americans were to come from India and attack Afghanistan, who is in between? Pakistan is in between.
It took only 2 weeks for the whole world to fall in line with the US. At the United Nations, in just 2 sessions, on the 12th and 28th of September, the Security Council unanimously legitimized the counterstrike. The council was presided over by France, which demanded a more solemn mode of voting.
Je vous invite à l'adopter non pas en levant nos mains, mais en nous levant pour montrer notre unité face au fléau du terrorisme.
Yet no envoys had been sent to Afghanistan. No demand for the extradition of terrorists had been addressed to the Afghan government. Pressure from the United States steamrolled over all of that. The world's leaders turned the upcoming war into an act of self-defense. French President Jacques Chirac was the first foreign head of state to visit the ruins of the World Trade Center. He willingly committed France to America's cause, finding the right words to turn a punitive expedition into a just war.
Ces attaques terroristes nous concernent tous. La France a indiqué qu'elle mènerait avec les États-Unis ce combat. Le peuple afghan, qui a tant souffert depuis 20 ans, qui est aujourd'hui victime d'un régime barbare, n'est pas en cause, bien sûr.
Le problème, c'est à ce moment-là, c'est comment vendre l'intervention aux opinions publiques. Tout le monde n'est pas convaincu que c'est Ben Laden qui a fait le 11 septembre. Tout le monde n'est pas convaincu que ça soit une bonne chose de répondre au 11 septembre par une invasion terrestre, par l'envoi de troupes en Afghanistan. Donc on va capitaliser à fond sur ce qui rend les talibans impopulaires dans les opinions occidentales, le statut de la femme.
The Taliban were synonymous with women wearing the burqa. In France, as in many Western countries, the Taliban were in the dock well before 9/11.
Les premières victimes des talibans, ce sont les femmes, ces fantômes que nous voyons déambuler dans les rues du bazar.
Since their coming to power in 1996, they'd been the target of successive campaigns. Various associations, intellectuals, and feminists stirred up public opinion against the Taliban regime. In the autumn of 2001, to the entire modern world, the Taliban represented the Middle Ages.
Cette burqa que les femmes portent en Afghanistan. Si vous demandez, je crois, maintenant en Europe, encore aujourd'hui, je crois que tout le monde vous dira que c'est les talibans qui ont inventé ça. C'est pas vrai. C'est quelque chose que les femmes afghanes portent depuis des siècles, je crois, certainement bien longtemps avant les talibans.
La conception de la charia des talibans correspond bien à une vision, la vision tribale pachtou de ce qu'est le rôle de la femme. Moi, quand j'étais à Kandahar en 69, je peux vous dire qu'on ne voyait pas de femmes. On pouvait passer 3 jours invité par c'était toujours des notables évidemment, sans jamais percevoir une femme, même voilée. Hein. Mais on s'est focalisé sur la question de la femme, d'abord parce que c'est spectaculaire, ensuite parce que c'est évidemment une question de société fondamentale. Il y a beaucoup de Français qui ont dû croire sincèrement qu'on intervenait pour libérer la femme afghane.
On the 7th of October, the offensive was launched.
Tomahawk cruise missiles.
4 weeks had passed since the fall of the Twin Towers in New York. Too little time to prepare for a war, but long enough to send the aircraft carriers and relay the powerful sounds of the American war machine to the world's TV sets. Vengeance was underway and it had a name, enduring freedom. In the skies, American domination was total. Flying fortresses and fighter bombers sprayed the Taliban defenses without hindrance. But in the first images of the fighting, it wasn't American soldiers that viewers could make out through the Afghan dust, but Afghan fighters, militias from the northern tribes, who had never accepted the authority of the Taliban. They were led by so-called warlords, who for several years had joined forces to form a formidable military and political power, the Northern Alliance. Ahmad Shah Massoud had been their charismatic leader, his aura spreading well beyond the Afghan borders. But Massoud was no longer there. He'd been assassinated on the 9th of September 2001. So it was his successor, General Fahim, and his allies who were given weapons and millions of dollars by the Americans to fight the war in their place. Empowered by this, they were able to remobilize their troops.
In that time, I was in the north of Afghanistan, and the world became united to remove Taliban regime.
طالبان تنها از اکثر از ولایات شمال و غرب افغانستان و مرکز افغانستان عقب نشینی کرده بود، به طرف جنوب و شرق و جنوب غرب وجود داشتند. قویی که بتواند طالبان تعقیب کنه و یا خلع کنه وجود نداشت. این برای مجاهدین در روز زمان خوشایند بود.
But forging an alliance with the northern tribal leaders was risky for the Americans. Afghanistan was a smoldering volcano, and these enemies of the Taliban had already played the role of liberators. In 1989, they'd received American dollars and arms and managed to force a retreat from the Soviet colossus, which had been occupying Afghanistan for over 10 years. It was an historic victory which contributed to the fall of the communist empire. Known as the Mujahideen, they'd become a symbol in the West of the fight for freedom. In 1992, Commander Massoud made a victorious entry into Kabul. But the joy was short-lived. The Mujahideen chiefs, who had been united against a foreign enemy, quickly turned against each other over the sharing of power. A long and bloody civil war ensued. Kabul, which had been spared during the 10 years of war against the Soviets, was now ravaged by the fighting of these Mujahideen chiefs. They fought over neighborhoods, street by street, each imposing his own law on his fiefdom. The country sank into terror and chaos, long years of brutality and pillaging, which took its toll on the people. In 1994, there was an uprising against the tyranny of the warlords in the Pashtun territories in the south. An uprising led by young men with their own severe interpretation of Islam. Their mission was to restore law and order. They were known as the students, or in Pashtun, the Taliban.
Les talibans, ce sont effectivement des séminaristes, des étudiants de madrasa, mais c'est surtout le moudjahid de base qui s'est révolté contre ses chefs parce qu'après la victoire sur l'Union soviétique, les chefs étaient devenus de véritables voyous.
In 1996, the Taliban took Kabul, forcing the warlords to pull back. Many fighters were hanged, while others escaped and sought refuge in the north. After 9/11, it was in the mountains of the north that the Americans came looking for them, to make them perfect allies in their campaign of vengeance. Who they were or what they'd done was unimportant. America was willing to share its revenge with them.
When the Americans showed up, you had these resentful warlords, okay? And when we said, we'll give you weapons, you can reconstitute your warlord armies, they instantly said, yes, we will do whatever you want. Just let us be warlords again.
One of the first to be contacted by the Americans was a former lieutenant of Massoud.
The CIA called me and they said, this is going to bring a very bright future for Afghanistan. We are going to come there in a massive way to defeat the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. You are enemies. They came. The biggest army in the world, the biggest economy in the world, comes to me and says, what shall I do? It's like all of a sudden, all of us become a Spider-Man.
From the first American bombardment, the Northern Alliance surged into action. Armed as never before, they launched the ground offensive against the Taliban.
It was a new form of fighting, actually, where you had, special forces personnel on the ground, sometimes actually riding on horseback, all right, that's actually true, Call in airstrikes based on the latest technology available, satellite, laser-guided, bombing. I mean, the latest, most precise bombing from the air was directed by special operations people riding horses.
The coalition's planes bombarded the Taliban, while on the ground, the Northern Alliance advanced. This combination of sophisticated technology and local territorial knowledge was effective. The armies of the North swept through the country. On the 9th of November, Mazar-e-Sharif, the main town of the North, fell. On the 12th, it was the turn of Herat in the West. On 13th of November, the Taliban abandoned Kabul and fell back to Kandahar in the south, where they'd come from. On the 14th, barely 5 weeks after the campaign began, Kabul fell to the militias of the Northern Alliance. Most of the towns capitulated without a fight. Taliban fighters were executed by the advancing armies of the Northern Alliance.
حالتا پایگاهان طالبان دي سهار و موږ سره خوب راویښ شو هم لیدل بعض طالبان څخه خبر ول مخکې نه هغوی تللي ول
که درها دیدم که هر طرف مرده طالبا افتیدگی بود موترایشان خراب بود یعنی جایایشان که ما پوسته میگیم برش پوستایشان که خراب شده بود حتی مردایشان افتیدگی بود که دوج همی رد کراس که صلیب سرخ است که هیچ نامده بود که مردایشان حتی جمع کنن
اکثریت دوی خلکو سه گیر کول په لار کې دوی په تېښته کې ول دوی په تیږو ویستل مثلا ډېر حتی داسې حالت ته رسول چې زوف دې کوو یعنې ډېر یې ووهل همدغه یو نماره په یاد همغه وخت کې قصه
It was a ghost town. More than 70% of Kabul were destroyed buildings, unattended buildings. In this part of town, after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, dogs were roaming, dogs who were used to eat human bodies, flesh, dogs, dangerous. Nobody could walk. Ghost town.
Apart from stray dogs, only the heavily armed militias ventured into the streets of Kabul, which was once again in the hands of the warlords. There was a very real danger of history repeating itself, of the country sinking once more into chaos and civil war. In their great haste to strike, the United States had no post-war strategy. Who would govern the country after the Taliban? What were they to do with these militias which they had armed to the teeth? With an entire country on their hands, the Americans turned to the UN.
In the White House, they recognized that the military campaign was actually moving more quickly than the diplomatic campaign, and so they were anxious to get the diplomacy moving. so that we didn't have to occupy and govern Afghanistan, which they definitely didn't want to do.
On the 27th of November 2001, 4 weeks after the military campaign got underway, an international conference was hurriedly organized in Bonn, Germany, a long, long way from the Afghan powder keg.
We encouraged the UN to organize a meeting bringing together all of the non-Taliban Afghan factions, the various elements of the country that had been opposing the Taliban, some from abroad, some within Afghanistan, in order to try to build a representative, broadly based government that could take over responsibility for the country.
In Bonn, pieces of the impossible puzzle were laid out. On one side were the Northern Alliance victors. On the other, the rich diaspora exiled in the United States. And caught in the middle, the nostalgic supporters of the exiled former king, Zahir. The complicated task of finding common ground among these parties fell to Lakhdar Brahimi, the United Nations envoy to Afghanistan, who presided over the conference.
Let's hope that history will record this day as the beginning of a new age for Afghanistan.
Il n'y avait que 35 personnes à Bonn. 35 Afghans, c'est tout. Et la conférence était dominée par les gens de l'Alliance du Nord parce que l'invasion américaine a vraiment consisté à leur redonner le contrôle du pays. C'est avec eux que j'ai traité. C'était eux les grands chefs avec lesquels nous avons négocié à Bonn. Parce qu'ils étaient déjà à Kaboul. Ils contrôlaient déjà Kaboul. Ce qui fait qu'ils ont dicté en réalité ce qui s'est fait largement. Ils ont très largement dicté ce qui s'est passé à Bonn.
The Northern Alliance, the victors at arms, were quick to adopt the civil attire of politicians, demanding a dominant role in the future Afghan government. The problems were just beginning. As it had been through history, Afghanistan was once more riven by the different ethnic groups which make up its people. The Northern Alliance represented only the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Hazaras, a minority in the country. Pashtuns are the majority ethnic group. However, they're also the group from which the Taliban come. This gave the Northern Alliance a pretext for demanding key government positions for themselves. But Western negotiators wouldn't hear of a government without Pashtuns. Excluding them would mean civil war. On the morning of the 4th of December, the UN negotiators were forced to admit that they were in a deadlock.
What is it that is holding up this process?
Good question. You have me there. The names have always been a problem. And I'm told, this is my first foray into Afghanistan politics, but I'm told those with more experience than me have said that you can have a beautiful agreement, but when it comes down to names...
The conference was due to conclude at 9 in the morning with a signing in front of the German Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder. And about midnight, the UN head of the conference called me in a panic to say that there was no agreement, that he couldn't get the factions to agree on the composition of a government because the Northern Alliance was insisting on having 18 of the 24 ministries, including all of the most important ones.
During the night, a compromise was found. The Northern Alliance got what they had demanded, key posts in the government. In exchange, they accepted a Pashtun as president of the provisional government. The Pashtun in question was Hamid Karzai, chief of a powerful tribe from Kandahar.
Hamid Karzai, c'est pas un inconnu. C'est le fils d'un ancien président du Parlement. Son père a été assassiné peu de temps avant le 11 septembre au Pakistan. Je l'avais moi-même rencontré à plusieurs reprises. Il était connu en Amérique et en Afghanistan. C'est un militant qui était connu.
Karzai had been involved in every Afghan political setup as an ally of Massoud and then of the Taliban before opposing them and seeking refuge in Pakistan. He represented in one man all the movements which had been tearing the country apart for 20 years. On December 5th, the Bonn Conference reached an agreement. The West congratulated itself on a war so quickly concluded. The war, however, was far from over. In the east of the country, near the Pakistani border, tanks of the Northern Alliance were on the move. There were incessant American airstrikes on the zones known to shelter al-Qaeda camps, but in vain. Osama bin Laden had escaped and remained at large. In the south, the Taliban were still resisting, holding on to their stronghold, Kandahar. The town was surrounded by the Northern Alliance militias, a bloodbath likely at any moment. Kandahar risked becoming the symbol of the clash between the ethnic groups of the north and the southern Pashtuns. This was the first test of Karzai's authority. Kandahar was his hometown. His first action was to go there personally to negotiate the town's surrender. It was an indispensable precondition for reconciling the country, a prerequisite for lasting peace.
What Karzai did is he just following the pattern that the Pashtuns have been following throughout their history, where you had a war, you had a fight, and then as soon as the fighting is over and one side is defeated, he makes the offer. Mullah Muhammad Omar will stop fighting, will stay in Kandahar, don't wander around, all right? And you will live in peace and dignity. Now, who announced this? Mullah Zaif, the Taliban ambassador in Pakistan.
Mullah Zaif, who had tried negotiating immediately following 9/11, was back in service. He announced the state of the negotiation.
Both sides, Hamid Karzai and Taliban authorities, agreed to surrender Kandahar for the welfare of people. Mullah Muhammad Umar agreed to surrender the power to them. They should try to save the life and the dignity of Mullah Muhammad Umar.
So what happened? The day after, Rumsfeld made a speech specifically abrogating that peace agreement.
George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense was Donald Rumsfeld, the man who conveniently made al-Qaeda and the Taliban one and the same thing.
Rumsfeld said, no one is going to live in peace and dignity that has supported terrorism, because we were still associating the Taliban with al-Qaeda, and we're conflating the two. And we were totally rejecting the idea of making peace with the Taliban.
Hamid Karzai caved in to the American veto, forgetting any plans for reconciliation or peace.
I think both the UN and Hamid Karzai wanted to try to reconcile with remaining Taliban elements. And unfortunately, the United States rebuffed that effort, and I think we're now pursuing reconciliation under much more difficult circumstances than would have been the case had we done so in 2002.
On the 7th of December, the Taliban gave up Kandahar without a fight, giving the impression they were disappearing for good. Nothing of the sort. Instead, they became a totally clandestine organization. Their leader, Mullah Omar, sought refuge in Pakistan and the Pashtun zones along the border. By refusing any negotiation, the Americans opted for a long, drawn-out war.
C'est ce que j'appelle, moi, la faute originelle. Les talibans se sont éparpillés, ils ont quitté les villes, mais ces gens-là contrôlaient 90% du territoire afghan. Où sont-ils allés? Ils n'ont signé de reddition à personne. Je crois aujourd'hui que si nous nous étions posé cette question sérieusement, la réponse aurait été que ces gens-là sont ici, et qu'il faut leur parler, qu'ils représentent quelque chose, et que peut-être ils pourront faire partie du consensus national.
The Americans turned the hunt for al-Qaeda into one for the Taliban. Ministers and fighters who were caught by the Americans were treated as neither prisoners of war nor common law criminals. They disappeared without trial into the black hole of the new secret American prisons, Bagram in Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay in the Caribbean.
The world community, by itself, they put the Taliban in isolation. There is no any window for dialogue. There is no any window for respect.
fellow citizens. In 4 short months, terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay. We saved a people from starvation and freed a country from brutal oppression.
In January 2002, George W. Bush's State of the Union address was one long cry of victory. Vengeance, it seemed, had been served. Unable to claim victory over al-Qaeda, they celebrated defeating the Taliban. Lacking a reconciled country, they invented a liberated Afghanistan.
America and Afghanistan are now allies against terror. We'll be partners in rebuilding that country. And this evening, we welcomed the distinguished interim leader of a liberated Afghanistan, Chairman Hamid Karzai.
Hamid Karzai was the face of the new era the Americans were promising Afghanistan. The Americans started writing the history of a victorious revenge. Donald Rumsfeld, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the man who had refused any discussion with the Taliban, visited Kabul to inaugurate this Pax Americana before the whole world's news cameras.
We're at a point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction, and the bulk of this country today is permissive, it's secure. It is clear that that's the case by virtue of the fact that we see people returning to their country from all across the globe in large numbers.
Between 2002 and 2004, millions of Afghan refugees who had fled 30 years of war and oppression returned home. They had heard the American promise: jobs, money, and elections. The West promised to export its democracy, comfort, and peace to Kabul. The country was more than willing to believe it, showing more trust in others than in itself.
All the people that came had great hopes for Afghanistan. We all were there ready to roll up our sleeves and go in there and rebuild the nation that had been destroyed over the past 30 years. Very hopeful.
Oh, God. It was euphoria. Euphoria, not hope. Maybe that's one of the problems. The euphoric expectation was so unrealistic. That was, on one hand, unrealistic for us to have those kinds of expectations because we were re-emerging from the ashes of unreal destruction and unreal tragedy. And on the other hand, it was unexpected expectations that were raised by the international community's own attention to this country.
C'était un moment un peu dingue où tous les rêves, tous les espoirs étaient permis pour ce pays. Enfin, on a des discussions enflammées sur à quoi allait ressembler l'avenir en Afghanistan et des discussions enflammées sur des projets qu'il fallait mettre en œuvre pour créer des liens avec les collectivités territoriales, faire du développement rural. C'est ce flot d'Afghans qui reviennent chez eux remplis d'espoir. Enfin, c'était une période extraordinaire, vraiment euphorique.
The euphoria was felt on both sides. Afghanistan believed in the scenario of the world that had come to sort out its problems. And the West was confident in its mission. Humanitarians were soon on the scene. NGOs from the world over converged on Afghanistan. But it was the arrival of an international military force in February 2002 which crystallized all the hope. Afghans watched as thousands of soldiers arrived in brand new uniforms bearing the ISAF logo of the International Security Assistance Force. To the Afghan people, it seemed like these troops, with their sophisticated weaponry, would have no trouble accomplishing their mission of containing and disarming the warlords and their powerful militias.
La première impression qu'on a eue lorsqu'on est venu ici en 2002, c'était, on avait l'impression d'être dans un rêve. On arrivait en zone inconnue complètement, quoi. Des us, des mœurs, des gens, des coutumes qu'on ne connaissait absolument pas, et un paysage absolument grandiose, quoi. L'Afghanistan, c'est un pays, le pays de tous les contrastes. Comme nous sommes arrivés, les talibans étaient pour la grande majorité partis. Bon, on n'en avait pas exactement la preuve, parce que déjà à l'époque, c'est ce que nous disaient les Afghans de Kaboul, on ne sait pas qui est qui. Donc on ne pouvait pas se fier à la population pour des sources de renseignement, parce que même eux ne savaient pas qui étaient leurs amis et leurs ennemis. Mais on pensait qu'à l'époque, oui, les talibans étaient en train de quitter le pays, oui.
French soldiers were given the task of training the first contingents of a multi-ethnic Afghan army, which would help the people forget the factions and militias which had reigned terror over the country for so long. This army was the precondition of the new Afghan state promised by the West, a huge challenge in a country ravaged by 30 years of war.
Et là, on va s'engager dans un engrenage dont on n'est pas sorti. C'est pas une opération de police qu'on met en Afghanistan pour se débarrasser de Ben Laden. On va construire un nouvel État afghan. On va construire une société afghane libérée. On va installer la démocratie en Afghanistan. C'est-à-dire qu'on passe à une opération de ce qu'on appelle nation building, state building, construction de l'État, construction de la nation, bonne gouvernance, etc., etc. Et ça, c'est notre paire de manches.
ما چیز داشتیم گفتیم افغانستان اونجا که خبر شدیم گفتیم افغانستان آرام شد آرام میشه افغانستان شاید که از ملک بیگانه کردن ملک خود ما پیشرفت شود آرامی شود همونجا روز ما به چاله صاحب خانه و صاحب زندگی شویم آمدیم اینجا آمدیم که چیز دارید فقط اون روز ما به چاله و خلاص پاکت از وزارت چیز جور نمیشه
ای آواز خر و نغمه داوود
The October 2004 presidential election. It was the first ever Afghan election with universal suffrage, and the people respected the process, flocking in great numbers to vote. In this country of clans and tribes, formerly ruled by a king, one man instilled some hope.
از پول خود سیر از سرک خود قیر از بندها و انهار و آرامش قانونیت مردم افغانستان است.
In the next episode,
the first parliament was probably one of the most unique parliaments in the history of this country. It was warlords, drug lords, corrupt people, good people, technocrats, communists, left, right.
All these large corporations have won these huge contracts and continue to make money off of the war, $10 billion a month.
The security situation in Afghanistan was declining. Taliban gains were extraordinarily worrisome.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
I figured it was going to be a fairly easy mission. And the reality when I got on the ground was completely different.
There was a procedure which was called PUC, person under control. And what you do is you put a bag over their head so they can't see, and then their hands are tied.
This is family life. This is tribe area. When you're killing one man, you are creating 5 more animals. By killing, increasing the problem.